How do you heal those very deep wounds and the damage of the past, when modern identities and movements are being formed from an era that gives people a sense of purpose and self-worth? Today, many revisionists are trying to rewrite the past, that is, altering man's place in time and space. And as the Creator's name has sadly been misrepresented by those who profess him, many want to put God on trial, and as a result of this phony courtroom, people have rejected the ticket to eternity and feel more comfortable to go back to the worship of nature. But there are people who are sincerely seeking for the truth, and they want stronger evidence instead of the foolishness that they usually see. And on this journey, you will be challenged about your reality, your deep-rooted prejudices, and how you as an individual can make that life-changing difference. If there is one lesson I have learned in this global lockdown, it is that you never really know who people are until a crisis hits. The moment you put pressure on people, you see who they really are. I've also learned that there are many ethnic groups who are very skilled at pretending that they are children of God and pretending that they see you as their equal. Then the moment you bring up the issue of race, their true colors are manifest. And in this study called Racism and Reconciliation, Part 2, we're going to cover some topics which we've covered in previous studies and elaborate on them. And we're also going to see the effects of racism in our modern societies. And as I encourage you at all times, please research everything you see in this study. And I'd also want to put out a disclaimer. This study is for people who are really, truly seeking God. The mountains are a place where, among its high isolated peaks, you can escape the very fast-paced hustle and bustle of the sometimes aggressive and jam-packed city life, and be in a very quiet place where you can solemnly reflect in the still of the day and hear your own voice. It may be treacherous depending on how deep you penetrate into the terrain of its space, but it is also a place where many go to escape. Some communities have lived in these isolated spaces for generations, and there was one community who resided in the mountains not only for a quiet space, but to survive for their own safety and security. They have been labeled the Israel of the Alps, the Vaudois or the Waldenses. They resided in northern Italy, and this community's motto was Lux Lucet in Tenebris, translated from Latin into English, light shining in darkness. In Italy, there are monolithic cathedrals whose grandeur would entice the civilian population of medieval Europe and still mesmerizes people today. Some of the architecture had a very detailed mathematical genius that still has not been surpassed to this very day. But this community was not impressed, neither enticed by these Gothic cathedrals, for they wanted to live a life of simplicity and not get spiritually corrupted into the very bureaucratic hierarchy of the organized religion of Papal Europe. They were not a denomination, but a movement whose true origins are a mystery. They were like most pre-industrial revolution communities around the world. They were self-sustaining and survived by agriculture. These color photos of the 19th century show the last few remaining of their descendants that survived centuries of persecution, who had greatly shifted from the original mandate of their medieval forefathers. One of their pastors, John Pons, born in the Waldensian valleys in the late 19th century, was not only a member of a Waldensian society, but when he migrated to America in the 20th century, he became a member of a Freemasons lodge, the Love Lady Lodge number 670, and received many high honors in that order. The Freemasons are an occult secret society that had its origins in the famous Knight Templars in the days of the Crusades. This is how far many of the modern Waldenses had shifted from the original gospel. But from the 16th to the 19th century, men in the West had closely studied them to understand who they were and what made them unique from the rest of the people of Europe. All of these men, who were soldiers, poets, doctors, historians, bishops, university deans, statesmen, lecturers, and theologians, would all write a large or short thesis on this community of people, for they were intrigued with their peculiarity and wanted to know what sustained them. The University of Cambridge, situated in the east of England, the second oldest university in the English-speaking world, has in one of its libraries a preserved manuscript that was discovered in the Piedmontese valleys in Italy. It has been titled in English The Noble Lesson, and dates to around the 12th century AD, that documents what the Waldenses originally stood for. And in London's Science Museum, there is on display an artifact with the inventor's name engraved on the bottom of a mathematical device, the precursor of the modern calculator, who preserved a copy of the Noble Lesson, and his name was Sir Samuel Morland. This 17th century English diplomat published a book in 1658 titled The History of the Evangelical Churches of the Valleys of Piedmont, and the introduction gives a picture of the center of their belief system. It reads, "O brethren, give ear to a noble lesson. We ought always to watch and pray, for we see the world nigh to a conclusion. We ought to strive to do good works, seeing that the end of the world approaches. For in this world, as Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 13 says, we are all pilgrims." So they were an end-time believing church who believed in the second coming of Christ. But did they just keep that teaching to themselves, or did they spread it? In a book titled The History of Protestantism, published in the year 1878, this classic work by the prolific writer, the Scotsman Dr. James Aitken Wiley, a man who paid an official visit to the Waldenses valleys in Italy, documents how far they spread their message. He said that the Waldenses stand apart alone in the Christian world. In their dispersion over so many lands, over France, the Low Countries, Germany, Poland, Bohemia, Moravia, England, Calabria, Naples, the Waldenses sowed the seeds of that great revival which, beginning in the days of Wycliffe and advancing in the times of Luther and Calvin, awaits its full consummation in the ages to come. The Waldenses went throughout many of the cities, towns and villages of Europe. They were very zealous and fearless in their pursuits, for it was a very, very risky task to spread the everlasting gospel throughout papal-controlled Europe. It could cost you your life. So they had to equip themselves effectively and thoroughly train their community with the right tools and with the most effective methods of evangelizing, and they followed the biblical apostolic model to the letter. In Mark chapter 6 and verse 7, Jesus instructed men to go in twos so that one can strengthen the other for support. In Acts chapter 18 and verse 3, each of the disciples had a trade to financially support themselves. In Acts chapter 2 verses 44 and 45, the early church financially supported all of its members. In James chapter 5 and verse 14, the church brethren would visit their sick members. And in Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 20, the foundation of each believer's faith should be in the authority of God's word alone. In a book titled The Israel of the Alps, the 19th century Franco-Italian pastor Alexis Mustin documented his spiritual forefathers' faith that was based on the apostolic model. The Vidoi of the Alps are, he said, in my opinion, primitive Christians or descendants or representatives of the primitive church, preserved in these valleys from the corruptions successively introduced by the Church of Rome into the religion of the gospel. Their doctrines may be briefly summed up in these few words: the absolute authority of the Bible. Their pastors were designated barbers, which means uncle. They were required to commit to memory the Gospels, the general epistles, and they were trained to speak in Latin, in the Romance language, and in Italian. So they were trained to speak in 3 different languages, and they were supported by the voluntary contributions of the people. The barbers received instruction in some trade or profession by which they might be enabled to provide for their own wants. Some were hawkers or vendors, that is one who travels selling ware. Others artisans, that is a worker in a skilled trade that involves making things by your hands. The greater part physicians or surgeons, and all were acquainted with the cultivation of the soil and the keeping of flocks, to the care of which they have been accustomed in early years. So it started from very, very young. very few of the pastors were married because it was too risky. Each pastor was required to become a missionary in his turn. The missionaries always went forth two and two, to wit, a young man and an old one, so that one can be a mentor to the other. The Vadoi were bound to the sick, whether sent for or not. The Vadoi had also their own houses of retirement from the world. The Vadoi are the chain which unites the Reformed Church with the disciples of the Saviour. So the barbers, or these pastor missionaries, travelled across the continent of Europe as hawkers to sell their products to finance themselves, and inside of their wares they would always have passages of the Holy Scriptures and would minister the word to those they were selling to as a witness. They also had a trade like the apostles, and they were skilled in making different items by their own hands to sell. Unlike most of us today who depend upon the state, they didn't have to shop for nothing, they made it themselves. They were very self-sufficient, but they also carried on these skills to their apprentices, so that the younger generation would be skilled in having a level of independence. They were also physicians and medical missionaries, where they may or must have had a knowledge in both botany and biology, so they could attend to a sick person whether in their own community or in the field, and they must have been familiar with the study of nature if they were to cultivate the soil and see how the cycle of nature worked, and especially when they did tend to their own flock. Can you imagine if pastors were trained like that today? They would visit the sick, and they also had their own retirement homes for the elderly, not depending upon the state. When we look at Bibles today, they all look pristine and clean. And look at the contrast with the Waldensian Bibles that are worn down and their leaves torn. You can clearly see the difference between professed Christians today and the people of the valley. For they thoroughly trained their children in the Holy Scriptures from very early. Do you want to know why? Because they were a constant target for invasion by the papal armies of the governments of Europe, who would either kill them or force them to convert to Catholicism. Many of these children knew the New Testament off by heart by the time they were 7 years old, so that they can stand their ground on their own when they were in court. For the soldiers would bust up their communities and put their foot on the Bible and destroy the Holy Scriptures and innocent people. Do you want to know why? Because the Waldenses put the authority of the Bible above the authority of the church, something very few do today. And these are some of the grotesque things they would do to men, women, and children. Neither age or gender was spared. And this is a model of what is going to happen in the future, but only to those who stay faithful to Christ. The monarchies of Europe, like King Louis XIV of France, would also hunt them down like animals. But when they were being persecuted, the seeds that they planted were now beginning to grow. Their evangelism was not in vain, and a movement was spreading throughout Western Europe that separated half of the continent from papal control. This monument in a field was erected in honor of a very little known figure who has had one of the greatest influences and impacts on the modern world. He was an Oxford-educated intellectual who was skilled in 7 languages fluently, and his whole desire was to teach an illiterate nation on how to read. And even though your average person in Britain has absolutely no idea of who he is, his painstaking hard work was not in vain. It left a very deep mark, and the British are reaping the benefits of his hard labour to this day. A number of men are carefully studying this man and his effect, and whether he is recognised or not, what is important is the powerful legacy he left behind. The London Independent newspaper in the year 1994, when describing his work, said that William Tyndale, translator in the 1520s and 1530s of the first printed Bible in English, a revolutionary innovator, one of the makers of our language and our civilization. Tyndale, following Old Testament Hebrew, invented the narrative flow of concrete images and short phrases joined by "and" to give a sense of forward movement and tragic inevitability. On a daily basis, we unconsciously quote William Tyndale's phrases. When people behave rebellious with no boundaries or accountability, we say he's a law unto himself, a William Tyndale quote. Am I my brother's keeper? A quote that denies any accountability for caring for someone else's well-being who is close to you or who you are familiar with, is also a phrase coined by or popularized by Tyndale. There are other famous Tyndale quotes like "fight the good fight," a phrase that encourages people to not give up and keep persevering. Eat, drink, and be merry, not encouraging people to be carefree and glutton, but to enjoy your mortal life. You are the salt of the earth, which shows that professed Christians should not only be distinct and unique to the rest of the world, but also an example to them. And the powers that be, a description of the current authority or government that is visibly in control and in charge. The narrator calls the invisible government, who are secretly pulling the strings behind the scenes, the powers that shouldn't be. Even the very secular, ultra-text-centered Shinto nature and worship culture of Japan, many of its most respected intellectuals have recognized that William Tyndale is a treasure to the modern world as documented in the Japan Times. For when you do a word check in your search engine on your computer, phone or tablet, you'd probably totally be unaware that Tyndale has shaped a language now tapped into computer keyboards from Tokyo in East Asia to Tierra del Fuego, the archipelago of the southernmost tip of the South American mainland, according to the London Guardian newspaper. This is the effect of his labor, but his love for people was to cost him his life. When you are living a selfless, sacrificial life to help others, you will always find very jealous people who want to try to destroy what you are doing and hinder you from helping others. But his martyrdom was not in vain. Though he was strangled and burnt, his death was going to have a trickle-on down effect throughout the British Isles. The two early 16th century Scottish martyrs were George Wishart and Patrick Hamilton. Their deaths were to heavily impact the ministry of John Knox. In Oxford you had the martyrs Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley and Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. And the Smithville martyrs in London were John Rogers and John Bradford. Most, if not all of them, were heavily impacted by Tyndale's Bible. And this man single-handedly had a huge effect on the growth of the British culture, especially through the different translations of the Bible. If England continued in this path, her positive effect on the earth would have been enormous. But guess what? Greed kicked in, and it was economic wealth that did override spiritual growth. But before we go there, we will observe some of its positive outcomes. For Dr. J. Wiley said that the Reformation brought with it a great and visible quickening of mind, a career in progress in all that relates to the greatness and happiness of man, in letters, in arts, in government, in industry, in manufacturers and in commerce, the progress of scientific discovery and the working of a free press. Education is a very important tool to develop the mind and expand one's thinking, and the Protestant education expanded the thinking of not only the people of Britain, but others of different ethnic groups who were also to be affected by its development of the human brain. The printing press that developed free speech, as well as the arts and the different forms of industry and manufacturers, exploded as a result of the Reformation. And during the Middle Ages, Britain was the leading supplier of wool to Europe, and just before the blockade in the US Civil War, it was the leading supplier of wool to the United States. The UK was also one of the leaders in scientific development, experimenting with different materials to understand how the world works, and she continues this teaching to the children. And it is trade that keeps all nations in the world economically stable. Without it, each nation will crumble. And to this very day, the City of London, the infamous Square Mile, is the economic centre of the world, giving advice and doing business with the whole planet. But with Britain's greatness has also come wickedness.
Well, Palestine is the centre of a great imperial act. The real demon in this is Israel, but it's not simply Israel. I mean, this is as much a British and American war against Palestine as it is an Israeli one. The integration of Britain, and especially the United States, which gives Israel $10 million a day, is complete. So it is, in one sense, it's a British, European, American war against the people of Palestine.
In 2013, a film was released called World War Z. The main storyline was about a virus that spread around the world, and they were looking for a vaccine. But where did the virus actually come from? According to NBC News in 2013, 7 years before the March 2020 global lockdown, it said in the film that the virus spreads quickly in, guess where? China, before being carried around the world by travel and commerce. That is very interesting. The Palestinians are depicted as crazy, violent, virus-carrying zombies who scale the wall to infect others, and they are gunned down mercilessly by the Israeli army, a clever attempt at dehumanizing them so the world has no sympathy when they are actually killed in real life. Today, there has been a shift where Human Rights Watch, who is usually pro-Israel, has called it an apartheid state, which is quite surprising when you find out who actually bankrolls them: billionaire George Soros. Hamas is usually presented as these cold-hearted, bloodthirsty Palestinian terrorists. But who actually created this group? I will let you in on a big secret, and do not be afraid to tell anyone, you promise? Okay. It was actually created by both Israel and the United States. You see, the latter has a reputation of training and financing splinter groups, and turns a blind eye to its atrocities until it clashes with their self-interests. As the journalist John Peel just said, Israel is financed and she is given arms by both the United States and Britain, these post-World War II Anglo-American partners who stoked the conflict in the Middle East. But it was Britain who really engineered the conflict when she controlled and occupied the lands of the fallen Ottoman Empire that included Palestine after World War I. And today, when people are tracing the root cause of the most emotionally charged conflict in modern times that is all over, guess what? Land. They trace it to the meddling of British colonialism in foreign lands with the 1917 Balfour Declaration. But this isn't the only place. There are more places that are fighting over that key word, land. Have you ever wondered what the very intense Indian-Pakistan conflict is over? It is not over religious differences. A Pakistani lawyer told a narrator a number of years ago that it is all over land, just like the Israeli-Palestine conflict. And it was an Englishman, a British lawyer, the Right Honourable Cyril John Radcliffe, who carved up the South Asian country into two states, Pakistan and India, known as the Partition of British India in 1947. The late Right Honourable Louis Mountbatten, the cousin to the present British monarch Queen Elizabeth II, was blown up by the IRA in 1979, and guess why? A statement from the IRA said, "This operation is one of the discriminate ways we can bring to the attention of the English people the continuing occupation of our country." Once again, land. He was the last Viceroy and Governor General of India who oversaw the partitions, and they are still fighting over who has the right to the region of the Kashmir Mountains. Once again, land. The narrator would also observe the very tense conflict between Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots while in the north of London. And the conflict is all over, guess what? Land. But who provoked it? The BBC documented that it was British undercover forces who were involved in fomenting the conflict between Greek and Turkish Cypriots for control of Cyprus 10 years before the 1974 partition of Cyprus. But for 4 centuries, there is one country where the fight over land has been an intense ongoing struggle, and it is usually kept out of the mainstream news. But when the English arrived on the Native American soil succeeding the Spanish, there is a huge chunk of their history that they have chosen to obliterate out of the school textbooks. With all the heated debates that rage on in the United States, the one that is very silent, sidelined, and does not get the same exposure as the issue of race, that very few talk about and the corporate media downplays, are the consistent treaties that have been broken for centuries and the encroaching of indigenous sacred sites, which is the illegal land grab of Native American land, the largest real estate theft in modern history by Euro-Americans. Many have been offered reparations in billions, but one of the poorest communities in the United States are not interested. They just want their stolen land back by the men whose forefathers took it by force and deception in the first place. When you look at these articles, the consistent word you see is land. President Abraham Lincoln passed a bill that was signed into law in May 1862 called the Homestead Act. It allowed men to migrate west, and it invited European immigrants to flood into America and to recolonize Native American land, and it transferred the Native Americans, sadly, onto reserves. You had to be 21 years old and older, and you were offered 160 acres of public land. Recent documents have shown that Abraham Lincoln wanted to deport blacks into the Caribbean colonies after the Civil War, so the act was clear he wanted to greatly Europeanize the North American continent. He was a member of the American Colonialization Society, which, according to the official White House Historical Association, was originally known as the American Society for Colonizing the Free People of Color of the United States. The American Colonization Society was founded in 1816 by a group of white elites that recruited support and financial backing from enslavers, the Protestant and Presbyterian churches, and others, including the federal government officials. Supporters, both abolitionists and enslavers, agreed that blackness was inferior and required removal in order to form a more perfect union. Abraham Lincoln also endorsed colonization earlier in his life and even during his presidency. He believed that black and white people could not coexist after emancipation, and supported sending freed black people to Liberia or Central America. On August 14, 1862, President Lincoln invited a group of prominent black leaders to the White House to discuss colonization. He argued that black and white people were not capable of living together in the United States, and that it was unfair to both groups to have to suffer in the other's presence. These black and white photos are of families who traveled west and migrated from Europe to give them a head start in life. Even if all weren't successful landowners or farmers, it was them whose acres of land they built upon that steered the United States of America into the nation that it is today, that fueled the industrial age, but at what cost? The Washington Post in 2016, when describing this theft of Native American land by force, said that the post-Civil War land grab, the Homestead Act, encouraged settlers to populate states such as Kansas and Nebraska. But it also led settlers to crisscross through lands assigned to native tribes and deplete their natural resources. The Homestead Act, says Blake Bell, historian at the Homestead National Monument in Beatrice, Nebraska, set the stage for the rapid development into the global power we became after World War I. So this land grab expanded the famous railway network, the first transcontinental railroad that connected east and west, and the US farming industry also. But it was at the expense of the theft of another people's stolen land, and in true Hollywood traditional storytelling, Native Americans are still being demonized as savages through film.
I'm not gonna hurt you! Do you understand English?
Dog jeg kan godt
Friend. It says your name is Johanna Leonberger. Indians took you when they attacked your family 6 years prior.
To this very day, Native Americans have struggled to be accepted as fully fledged 14th Amendment US citizens in their own native country because of the confiscation of their own land. And a few in the US government have attempted to introduce a sort of assimilationist program to civilize, or they called it Christianize, which was really to Europeanize the Native Americans into mainstream society, where they change both their Native American language and attire into more modern Western ways. This program started with Herbert Walsh, a United States political reformer who co-founded the Indian Rights Association in 1883. And when you go to the official Presbyterian Historical Society website, you can see that the church played a central role in its so-called civilizing program. The first line of a document reads, "As the object of all efforts for the civilization of the Indians should be to facilitate their absorption into the social and civil life of the nation, we regard the instruction of their children in the English language as one of the most important means to this end." The reason for this is because they labeled the indigenous population as savages. That was even embedded into the comics of the 20th century, which was a means to dehumanize them and justify killing them. And the people who started this genocidal mandate were the early English settlers in the 1600s and their children. In a book titled A Brief History of the War with the Indians in New England, published in the year 1676, the Puritan Richard Mather laid the foundation of the dominant North American mindset that still exists today. And this is what he said: "That the heathen people amongst whom we live and whose land the Lord God of our fathers have given to us for a rightful possession. This is why the Native Americans hate God. For today the Euro-Americans are still saying the exact same thing, have at sundry times been plotting mischievous devices against that part of the English Israel." He saw the migration as the children of Israel leaving Egypt into the promised land. His son Cotton Mather also said that in this last age, the Lord set up the spirits of so many thousands of his servants to leave the pleasant land, a prophetic title that God applies to the city of Jerusalem in the book of Daniel chapter 8 and verse 9, but he spiritually misapplies to England, the land of their nativity, and to transport themselves and families over the ocean sea into a desert land in America, in this our New England. So he saw America as a New England, a so-called promised land, enjoying and advancing a true reformed religion in a practical way. But who is denied the benefits of this reformed religion? He said that the evident hand of heaven appearing on the side of a people whose hope and help was alone in the Almighty Lord of hosts. He attributed God to the wiping out and extinction of the indigenous population, who he calls savages. Extinguished whole nations of the savages at such a rate that there can hardly any of them now be found under any distinction upon the face of the earth. With a foreign invasion in North America, it did lead to a purging of not only whole communities of human beings, but to innocent animal species also, where tragically 5 billion of the indigenous passenger pigeons were totally exterminated. That is completely insane. The native dog species was also wiped out with many different tribes of the indigenous people. And the slaughter that started with the English Calvinistic immigrant community laid the foundation for succeeding centuries. But they had a very twisted view of God and the Bible that had no scriptural support. Jesus in Matthew chapter 18 and verse 11 said that he came to restore fallen man back into the original image of God, our characters. In Luke chapter 9 verses 54, 55 and 56, before Pentecost, his hot-headed disciples wanted to consume those who they thought were getting out of line. And Jesus told them that they are of the wrong spirit, for he did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. The Puritans obviously ignored that passage of scripture. And in Luke chapter 22 verses 50 and 51, we know that Peter was just hardcore gangster. You see, Galileans were fighters from birth, Flavius Josephus tells us. Jesus said his spiritual kingdom should not be defended by violent retaliation. He wants the gospel to replace the gangster. You see, the Waldenses went throughout the continent of Europe on a self-sacrificing mission to humbly evangelize its inhabitants. But the Europeans who migrated to America went to conquer, murder, steal, and to so-called civilize. And there is this conflict in sensationalist idealism, what most people want to hear about concerning America's origins, and there is the realism that a few open-minded people are humbly trying to come to terms with.
What does it mean to be an American?
We've proven as a nation, you give us a mountain to climb, and we'll show you how to climb it.
I run a logistics company. As I said in a recent interview, we deliver groceries from Cape Town all the way up through the DRC. We do a lot of aviation operations in East Africa. We're the biggest medevac provider for the UN. So we go back in time. You think about how America was started. Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, Jamestown colonies. They were companies. They were companies listed on the London Stock Exchange. And they hired people, they hired contractors. They hired guys like John Smith or Miles Standish, who were not British soldiers. They were professional, they were mercenaries.
Well, I mean, if we go back to the founding documents, their introduction was not something that occurred in an environment of purity.
That's right.
If we think carefully about the origins of the struggle for independence on the part of the 13 colonies, that struggle was deeply linked to the attempt to preserve the practice of slavery in the United States. And so the founding documents are documents that make or provide a declaration of liberty for a minority of the American population. And I say a minority because in a strict sense, the founding documents did not really include white women.
That's right.
But they definitely excluded black people collectively from the benefits and fruits of the formation of a new country.
In order to truly understand American history and its effects on us today, we have to go right back into time of when it developed with the colonization of the English immigrants. In the School of Oriental and African Studies, also known as SOAS University in central London, a 24-year-old man, the late Guyanese historian Walter Rodney, while studying there, wrote his doctorate thesis in May 1966, titled A History of the Upper Guinea Coast. It can be brought in book form, but it can still be found and downloaded for free on the official website of SOAS. And in that thesis he documented that the English had been trading slaves during the 16th century with the full sanction and participation of their queen. It was the Dutch and the English who moved into the vacuum created by Portuguese weakness in the southern portion of the Upper Guinea Coast. On the Upper Guinea Coast itself, there were a number of English voyages in the 2 decades before 1580. John Hawkins made 3 trips in 1562, 1564 and 1567. In London's Harrow School is engraved on one of its main buildings a statue of the last of the 5 Tudor monarchs of England, Queen Elizabeth I, the daughter of King Henry VIII. It was during her reign that England was turning into a global naval power, conquering the waves, the sea lanes and the other European powers also for domination. Plymouth-born English Admiral Sir John Hawkins was the first English slave trader who traded black African slaves between Guinea and Brazil. Just look at the heartless coldness stare in his eyes. He was given a ship titled Jesus by Queen Elizabeth I, and his crest or coat of arms is of a captive demi-Moor slave that is bound. He was the chief architect of the Elizabethan Navy. But the 2 men who opened the door of American colonization were English soldier and explorer Sir Walter Raleigh on the right, and Sir Humphrey Gilbert, the English soldier and explorer and half-brother of Sir Walter Raleigh, on the left. According to the Royal Museums of Greenwich, it was Sir Walter Raleigh who helped colonize America for the English. And in Plymouth there is a plaque in a 400th year commemoration anniversary of Sir Humphrey Gilbert's colonization of the Americas that laid the foundation of the next occupation. In London's St. Paul, opposite the Central Criminal Court of England and Wales called the Old Bailey, there is a blue plaque with yellow writing, and the 5th name from the bottom is of Captain John Smith, the first governor of Virginia. He is buried inside of the church with a plaque in commemoration of the burial spot, and he was the man who laid the foundation for modern day America. There is also a statue of him erected in St. Paul's, for he was an explorer, a governor, and a mercenary soldier who fought in the Netherlands, that joined the Virginia Company, renamed the new colonized territory New England, and mapped out the state of Virginia. This was the foundation of the Jamestown colony. If you were to come out of Rotherhithe railway station in Southwark in South London and take the first left, walk up and take another left, you'll find a pub called the Mayflower. There is a reason why this pub has been given this name, for it has great historical significance. Opposite the pub there is a church on St. Mary Church Street, and in the grounds of that church is a man holding a child where he is looking towards America. The name of the man is on a plaque on that church, and his name was Christopher Jones of Rotherhithe, the captain of the English ship, the Mayflower. On the back of the pub is both the US and UK flags, and Christopher Jones sailed from Rotherhithe on the River Thames to southwest England to a port in southwest Devon called Plymouth. And this started the journey in 1620 of the second English colony in America, where they landed on a part in America that was renamed Plymouth by John Smith. There is a huge statue in America to a man who was central to the Pilgrim Fathers' safety. Who is he? On board the Mayflower ship was another English mercenary who also fought in the Netherlands, who was kneeling in prayer on the far right. He was a short, stocky, hot-tempered, red-haired soldier and colonist whose name was Miles Standish. He was the military protector of the English Plymouth colony, whose mercenary army was known for being quite brutal and violent to the Native Americans. And this was how America was started. A company in Jamestown in Virginia and a company in Plymouth, Massachusetts in New England of English settlers. But how did it financially sustain itself? Historians will tell you that it was hard work, but these recent articles in the public Anglo-American newspapers are in memorial of the 400-year anniversary of a ship that landed at Virginia with 20 black African slaves that many have said ushered in the era of slavery in the United States. Some have recently called it the 1619 Project. It was the English ship, the White Lion, who captured these black Africans from Angola from a Portuguese slave ship during the reign of King James. But the ship was owned by the Puritan Robert Rich, the second Earl of Warwick, the English colonial administrator who commanded the Parliamentary Navy. How central was the forced slavery of black Africans to the economic growth of these English companies under the London Stock Exchange? The human body and how it functions is amazing, and anyone who says that it came about by a random chance has got to be completely crazy. When describing God's hand in creation, the patriarch Job said, "Thou hast clothed me with skin and flesh, and hast fenced me with bones," and the word highlighted in red is sinews. How central are the sinews to the structure of our body? The Concise Oxford Dictionary says that the sinews are the fibrous tissue that unites muscle to bone, that is the strength that sustains and holds together the framework of our body. In the National Archives in Kew in southwest London, there is a very interesting statement preserved in a colonial document. It is in the Calendar of State Papers of America and the British West Indies, Part 1, dated to the middle to the latter part of the 17th century, and a portion of the correspondence between an English merchant, Renatus Ennis, to King Charles II's secretary, Henry Bennet, says that were the planters supplied with, and please look at the words highlighted, Negroes, the strength and sinews of this Western world, they would advance their fortunes and His Majesty's customs. This is what built up the Western world and kept it financially stable. In London's St. Paul's Cathedral is buried a man who misquoted the Bible to justify this horrific traffic. And Bishop Thomas Newton said in the 18th century that the poor Negroes are conveyed from one quarter of the world to the work of beasts in another. Nothing can be more complete than the execution of the sentence upon Ham as well as Canaan. But in a book published in 1882 titled The History of the Negro race in America. The adventurous African American George Washington Williams totally annihilated that argument and said that, driven from unscriptural and untenable ground on the unity of mankind, the enemies of the Negro, falling back in confusion, entrenched themselves in the curse of Canaan. He quotes Genesis chapter 9 verses 24 and 25 that says, "And Noah awoke from his wine, and knew what his younger son had done unto him. And he said, Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren." This passage was the leading theme of the defenders of slavery in the pulpit for many years. Now, Noah was not inspired when he pronounced this curse against Canaan, for the sufficient reason that it was not fulfilled. He was not speaking in the spirit of prophecy when he blessed Shem and Japheth, for the good reason that their descendants have often been in bondage. And all this was done without any inspiration. He simply expressed himself as a fallible man. They were not the words of prophecy, and consequently never had any divine authority. Argument done. There are other passages of the Holy Scriptures that have been taken out of context. Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 5 says that servants should be obedient to their masters, another text that was misapplied during slavery. But when you read the succeeding text in its entirety, especially verse 9, the Bible says that these same masters are meant to treat their servants fairly and do not in any way threaten them. This same divine counsel is repeated in Colossians chapter 4 and verse 1, where the masters are instructed to treat their slaves just and equal and not as an underdog, as they also have a master in heaven. And in the book of Philemon, Paul instructs him that now he is a Christian, he is to treat Onesimus, his servant, as no longer as a servant, but above a servant, a brother beloved. So the Holy Scriptures are very clear on the text on slavery. But the damage of the past has greatly affected people's attitudes in the present, and it is God's name that is now under attack.
Say in The God Delusion, one of my favourite sentences that jumps out of the page, that the God of the Old Testament is a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capricious, malevolent bully. As a piece of rhetoric, superb. But do you really believe that?
We charge the God of the Bible as being woefully racist, prejudiced, and dealing in fake news. The proof being the Bible and all of its ethnocentric biases, religiocentric and nationalistic mumbo-jumbo that has been aimed at every nation, every religion, women, and even gay people. Where was God when the indigenous populations in the Western Hemisphere were being annihilated? The so-called Indians, the Native Americans.
Remember, you went into slavery under God, the good ship Jesus, chat. You went in because they made that up.
When Jesus died at Calvary, heaven and earth was reunited over again, where humanity reconnected with divinity. The just died for the unjust, and the argument over whether God is merciful or not was settled on the cross. But man has the nerve to still want to put God on trial and falsely accuse him of committing crimes against humanity and lay out a string of charges against him. And these men very cleverly cherry-pick history to present such a ridiculous case. This is what they have overlooked. A number of years ago, the narrator knew two young men who were fed up with the church. They left and then joined Islam. But after a while, these two men both returned back to the church, and they told the narrator why, as you shall see from the following articles. Black Africans have been enslaved in the Islamic Republic of Iran in the Middle East in Western Asia, and covertly to this day in the Arabic-dominated West African country of Mauritania. Arab Muslims are buying blacks as slaves on Instagram and on different apps. And they are also auctioned for sale in post-Gaddafi, Berber-dominated Libya in North Africa. And while this may be shocking to many, the poster, dated to 1911 AD, shows in pre-Gaddafi Libya, they were also trading in black African slaves. Throughout most of Islam's history, they have been enslaving blacks, and it has not stopped. It is embedded in the fabric of its culture, and they still call blacks Abid Allah, which means the slave of Allah. Why do these African Americans sidestep this episode of ancient and current events that still takes place on the African continent, but want to blame God, but ignore what is happening to the land of their forefathers, where black Muslims also traded their own blacks to both white Christian Europeans and Islamic Arabs? Men like the 18th century Fulani Muslim Job ben Solomon on the right, son of a Muslim high priest, who was trading in his own black slaves, then he himself was captured by blacks and they sold him to whites. And Tipu Tip on the left, a 19th century Afro-Arab slave trader who profited from selling blacks to the world and for the greedy sultans of Arab-controlled Zanzibar in East Africa. And if you look at this photo, you can see a black Muslim on the left brutalizing these chained black women, and these blacks will enrich and enhance the profits of the greedy Asiatic Islamic world and the greedy Western Christian world. And these African Americans cunningly ignore this episode of history, and both black and white have the audacity to call the Creator God a racist. In part 1 of this study, it was shown near the end in Genesis and in Numbers that God allows his people to intermarry. God is not interested in racial purity, but a people preserving his name and character on the earth. Let us give another example. In Jeremiah chapter 38 verses 7, 8, 9 and 10, we are introduced to a black African, a eunuch in the court of Judah called Ebed Melech, which means servant of a king. He was the only person in the southern kingdom of Judah who boldly stood up for the prophet Jeremiah and pleaded his cause before King Zedekiah. So a descendant of Ham defended a descendant of Shem, and for his faithfulness in chapter 39 verses 15, 16, 17 and 18, God himself directly spoke to Jeremiah and said that when King Nebuchadnezzar's army invades Jerusalem, Ebed Melech will get special protection. He will not be touched by the oncoming onslaught. Why? Because as the words in blue reads, I will surely deliver thee, because thou hast put thy trust in me, saith the Lord. There is no respect of persons with God, Romans chapter 2 and verse 11 says. He looks at your heart, not at your race. In Job chapter 34 and verse 19, it is clear that God does not regard the rich more than the poor. Jesus said that God the Father makes his sun to rise both on the evil and on the good, and he sends rain on the just and the unjust. This is who God is, and there is no need for him to be on trial. But the narrator will look at why people are frustrated, and we have to look at the United States of America. In the Calvinist theologically dominated colony of the Puritan Pilgrim Fathers, there was no such thing as free speech or religious or civil liberty. This company under the London Stock Exchange was run as a theocracy. If you did not adhere to their unbalanced, rigid brand of Calvinistic Christianity, they were so extreme that if you stepped out of line, it could even cost you your life. Some were actually murdered if they practiced or proselytized their own Bible or non-Bible based Christianity. Men and women were also beaten if they practiced their own style of Christianity that was not Calvinistic. And if these English immigrants would treat their own ethnic group so brutally, then it does not take rocket science to see how they would treat others. If you were even suspected of witchcraft, you were brought before a tribunal like the Salem witch trials, and they would try you and then they would kill you. Samuel Sewall, the English-born Massachusetts Bay judge, businessman and printer, who's mentioned in part 1, apologized for the mock trial, for he knew it was unfair. He criticized the mistreatment of blacks in slavery and of the mistreatment of Native Americans. But his sincere conversion experience and change of heart fell on deaf ears. The psychological tool that the colony used to manipulate others and is still used today by virtually all of the churches in the world to keep their members in line, a great shift from the Apostolic Church, is the most powerful manipulating spiritual weapon to control professed Christians, where each one would blindly and fanatically defend their church or brand of Christianity more zealously than they would actually defend Jesus Christ himself, an unbiblical methodology called theology. What exactly is theology? According to the South Herzog Encyclopedia of Religious Knowledge, theology is, as the words highlighted in gold says, the science of the Christian religion as taught in the Bible and carried on in the history of the church. So theology is a merging of the Bible with Western church history, where people can be manipulated with historical data. If these fanatic Calvinists were to actually follow the Bible in the spirit of humility, they would have seen that they were way off. Galatians chapter 5 and verse 14 says that for all the law is fulfilled in this one word, even this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Jesus in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 14 is clear that if nobody wants to hear what you have to say about salvation and eternity in the gospel, you do not debate with them, argue with them, or get irate. You move on and leave them alone. In Galatians chapter 6 and verse 1, if someone has fallen into an error, those who are spiritual are to humbly restore them in the spirit of meekness, so you don't fall into the same trap yourself. How often do you see that in the church? And in Luke chapter 3 and verse 14, when the soldiers were asking counsel from John the Baptist, he said to them, do violence to no man. The Puritans had clearly shifted from the true biblical teachings of the Apostolic Church. In two books titled Ebony and Ivy by Craig Stephen Wilder and New England Bound by Wendy Warren, both authors, quoting from official credible state documents, list the names of all the early Puritans and Ivy League University heads who each owned their own black slaves. They were John Winthrop the Younger, who was born in Suffolk, England, and became the governor of Connecticut and a commissioner of the United Colonies of New England. Increase Mather, who the narrator mistakenly called early in the study Richard Mather, and his son, Cotton Mather. The English-born, Oxford-educated, Anglican-trained Calvinist preacher George Whitefield, who introduced and owned slaves on a plantation in Georgia to finance his Bethesda orphan home, and he became the colony's leading proponent of slavery's legalization, where he helped to overturn the 1735 law that banned slavery in the English colony of Georgia. Jonathan Edwards Sr. was the third president of Princeton University, a Calvinist congregational preacher and philosopher-theologian who also owned slaves. John Witherspoon, a Scottish-born Presbyterian minister, the sixth president of Princeton University and a founding father of the United States of America, also owned slaves. Eliza Stiles, Congregationalist minister, seventh president of Yale University and co-founder of Brown University, also owned slaves. Samuel Davies, who was a Presbyterian minister and the fourth president of Princeton University, also owned slaves. Eleazar Wheelock, Congregationalist minister, founder and first president of Dartmouth College, also owned slaves. And Charles Grandison Finney, Presbyterian minister and second president of Oberlin College, also owned his own slaves. Today, many churches are trying to do a very slick, clever PR maneuver to cover up their disgusting past crimes of white supremacy, like the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, better known as the Mormons, showing themselves as a multiracial community, but their history is also rooted in slavery and Freemasonry. Anthony Woodward Evans, a Mormon apostle, published a book titled The Relationship of Mormonism and Freemasonry, so they don't even hide it, and in a book titled Occult Theocracy, posthumously published in 1933. The late Edith Starr Miller, quoting from John Blanchard, who was an abolitionist, and his book on Scottish Rite Freemasonry, she documented that Joseph Smith was a Mason, and he was succeeded by Brigham Young. About Mormonism and Masonry, Blanchard makes the following remark: the two institutions are morally and legally the same. Their co-founders, Joseph Smith on the right and Brigham Young on the left, both believed in the ridiculous unscriptural curse of Ham theory. They were both deeply racist and believed that slavery should remain in the United States and should not be abolished, and they were both Freemasons. You can see Brigham Young's Masonic pin on his shirt that he wore throughout his life. According to the Mormon Journal, the Latter-day Times, Brigham Young allowed slavery to flourish in the Mormon state of Utah, and many of the early Mormons, Abraham Owen Smoot on the left and Charles Colson Rich on the right, owned blacks as slaves. In an article in the Los Angeles Times titled California's Forgotten Slave History, it documents that slaveholders occupied the higher echelons of the Mormon hierarchy in San Bernardino. According to US Census data and the records of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the colony's co-founder and its bishop owned slaves. The Saints exploited dozens of African Americans who had brought with them from Utah, as well as an untold number of coerced Native American laborers. Many blacks had different responses to their enslavement by their European oppressors. According to Newsweek magazine, in 1787, two black men, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, were thrown out of St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church in Philadelphia for sitting in the whites-only section of the church. The next day, a group of African Americans who witnessed the encounter brought a vacant store and started their own church, and the African Methodist Episcopal Church was born. So as a result of these deeply racist systems that call themselves Christian churches, these two men founded their own church, which is why you have black churches in the Western countries today. But not all blacks were as tolerant. In this house in Virginia, a killing took place in 1831, and this was the sword that was used in the execution. The man who orchestrated the killing was a self-proclaimed lay preacher called Nat Turner, who just had enough of the oppressive slave system in America and decided to take action. His murders of men, women, and children has been labeled as a brutal killing. That if you look at it through a Western lens. But when you closely analyze Nat Turner's killing of over 50 people in Virginia, and you compare it to the total Holocaust and genocide of the indigenous Native American men, women, and children that was highly praised and glorified by Cotton Mather, the killings were very tame, mild, and minor in comparison. Europeans did far more horrors to blacks, from the kidnapping from Africa, packed as sardines on a slave ship, and then treated as subhuman on a plantation with no pay. Though he was eventually caught, snitched on by his own race, it sent a message of fear to white Christian America that blacks were fed up with this false, racist, oppressive system that proclaimed to represent Jesus Christ, and many would take action. The Spanish-speaking country of Mexico in Central America has only recently recognized its population of descendants of black African slaves. Many people have heard of the Underground Railroad, where slaves fled to the north under its captain Harriet Tubman. But recent evidence has come to light that blacks also fled from that so-called Christian nation into Mexico and joined the existing small black community already existing there. For unlike America, where you would be in fear of being returned back to the South because of the fugitive laws, that wouldn't happen in Mexico. Once you were there, you were free and safe, and many of the blacks and indigenous Mexicans formed a strong bond. When they fled to Mexico, they were escaping the black codes in French Louisiana, and this is why many fled like the two men on the right. They fled being tortured like the man on the far right, being left in rags like the boy in the center, and being a hewer of wood and drawers of water with no pay like the boy on the left. Being a sexual slave where your body is being prostituted for those disgusting Protestant men who treated black women as their side hustle on the left, and being shackled with no mercy like this man from New Orleans on the right. This is why they fled this so-called Christian nation. These African American men have only been recently recognized as continuing Nat Turner's revolt by agitating the issue of slavery. The Washington Post documented that they have been written out of history when they rose up with the famous Baptist preacher John Brown. The famous Harper's Ferry raid, the precursor to the American Civil War, was led by John Brown, where he sacrificed 2 of his own sons as well as himself in an attempt to end slavery in America. He is deeply respected by African Americans. But what was one of the underlying reasons they revolted? Today, in the corporate world, in the workplace, blacks and whites in the English-speaking world work in harmony with each other in most of the industries, an atmosphere that you will really see in the Western churches. And this is because blacks were given the opportunity to read. And when you can read, it expands your thinking and allows you to have a broader view of the world you live in. Why was this opportunity taken advantage of? In a book titled The Negro in the New World, published in 1910, the English colonialist Sir Harry Johnson said, "It is noteworthy that the Roman Catholic Church and the Protestant Episcopal Church, the Anglican Church in the United States, maintain nothing in the way of Negro education, have never at any time shown particular sympathy with or desire to help the Negro slave. Indeed, in slavery times, numerous bishops and institutions of the Church of England, which afterwards became the Protestant Episcopal Church, held slaves." In a book titled Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, the abolitionist Harriet Beecher Stowe continuing said, "Does not every American Christian owe to the African race some effort at reparation for the wrongs that the American nation has done unto them? Shall the doors of churches and schoolhouses be shut upon them, denied education again?" Continuing in a book titled The American Churches, the Bulwark of American Slavery, published in 1840, the US abolitionist James Gillespie Barney said, "The slave states make it penal or against the law to teach the slaves to read, so also some of them to teach the free colored people to read. Thus a free colored parent may suffer the penalty for teaching his own children to read even the scriptures. None of the slave-holding churches or religious bodies, the Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian, and Episcopal churches, so far as is known, have at any time remonstrated with the legislators against this iniquitous legislation or petitioned for its repeal or modification." Jesus in Matthew chapter 28 verses 19 and 20 said that one of the keys of spreading the everlasting gospel is to teach all nations. But the churches in North America did not see that as an obligation to teach its slaves. The Waldenses made it their absolute duty to teach the gospel throughout the continent of Europe. But there was one former slave who also saw that the churches in North America had greatly shifted from the apostolic church. In the 19th century, a man was to seek temporary asylum in Victorian Britain for fear of being sold back into slavery in the United States. It was in this building in the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea in South London that has the most expensive residential streets in England and Wales, on the road Whitehead's Grove, that this man lived and stayed here for a while. The United States Embassy and the Nubian Jack Community Trust erected a plaque in his honor, and his name is Frederick Douglass, former slave, orator, social reformer, and statesman. In the 19th century, with the advent of still photography and cinematography, Frederick Douglass took advantage and mastered this new revolutionary media to market his abolitionist cause around the United States of America. And on a closer review, he has been observed as the pioneer of the social media selfie by becoming the most photographed individual in 19th century America, not for vanity's sake, but to change the way people viewed the black race by always looking very slick and smartly dressed in front of the still camera. Today, the Western world is claiming him as a product of their working, for they finance his abolitionist lectures. But the person who was usually sidelined and the one who really put Frederick Douglass on the map was his first wife and #1 supporter, the little-known Anna Murray Douglass. She used all of her savings she worked for as a maid to finance his freedom. And as documented in the Smithsonian, without Anna, Frederick may have never achieved fame for his abolitionism or even escaped slavery. In a book titled My Mother as I Recalled Her from Her Daughter, it documented that Anna was the real support and true backbone to Frederick's rise to notoriety, and she gave him 5 children. And if it was not for her self-sacrifice and deep loyalty, there would be no Frederick Douglass. He joined the abolition movement in the North and took advantage of these freedoms by printing a journal called the North Star, where he would print articles and even write his own songs. His library in his home he purchased was huge. He had a vast volume of books, but there is a reason for this. It was as a result of being denied an opportunity by his former racist owner Thomas Auld, where he learned an object lesson from and from the church. At the South, he said, I was a member of the Methodist Church. They treat us not as men, but as dogs. You close your colleges and seminaries against us. Denied education again. The slaveholding ministers preach up the divine right of the slaveholders to property in their fellow men. The Southern preacher says to the poor slave, oh, if you wish to be happy in time, happy in eternity, you must be obedient to your masters. Their interest is yours. They sadly manipulated the Holy Scriptures. Very soon I went to live with Mr. and Mrs. Auld. She very kindly commenced to teach me the ABC. After I had learned this, she assisted me in learning to spell words of 3 or 4 letters. Just at this point of my progress, Mr. Auld found out what was going on and at once forbade Mrs. Auld to instruct me further, telling her, among other things, that it was unlawful as well as unsafe to teach a slave to read. Interesting. To use his own words, further, he said, if you give a derogatory description of blacks, an inch, he would take an L. A should know nothing but to obey his master, to do as he is told to do. Learning was spelled the best in the world. Now, said he, if you teach that, speaking of myself, how to read, there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once be unmanageable and of no value to his master. This American Republic was run as a slaveocracy. These words sank deep into my heart. I was gladdened by the invaluable instruction which, by the merest accident, I had gained from my master. I set out with high hope and a fixed purpose, at whatever cost of trouble, to learn how to read, and accordingly devoted my Sundays to teaching my fellow slaves how to read. There is a lot you can learn from racism. It teaches you how a race of people thinks, and Frederick Douglass made it his duty to not just enrich his own thinking, but to also boost the intellectual strength of his own fellow blacks. That is the true key to success, helping others. He was later appointed in life as an envoy to the French Creole-speaking Caribbean island of Haiti, and he knew that this was the home of modern black liberation against European oppression. He presented his credentials to Haiti President Louis Hippolyte, and as he was not versed in French, he appointed former Haitian envoy Ebenezer Bassett to assist him and help if there was a breakdown in communication. He toured the island and deeply respected its natural beauty and its people. But there are some who try to airbrush their struggle out of the record books. Thomas Sowell is a Harvard-educated American economist, a senior fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, who was schooled by his mentor, the late Milton Friedman, in the Chicago School of Economics worldview. He published a book titled Black Rednecks and White Liberals in 2005, and you can see why he is so praised by the American West. He presents the modern white savior worldview. He said that Europeans nevertheless became in the 19th century the destroyers of slavery around the world, not just in European societies or European offshoot societies overseas, but in non-European societies as well. And the narrator has highlighted the French in the French West African and Caribbean colonies. The English praise themselves as intercepting slave ships in Africa by the Royal Navy, but they cleverly hide from the historical textbooks the kidnapping of Pacific Islanders from their own countries, known as blackbirding, by the English at the same time in the 19th century, who were transported to Australian sugar plantations to boost the economic fortunes of the West. Britain also forcibly transported over 100,000 of their own orphan children from England into Australia, Canada and South Africa after the Second World War from the 1940s to the 1970s to work as indentured labourers on plantations who suffered physical and sexual abuse, and as adults they are still very traumatized. A quiet episode of her modern history. And in the French Caribbean colony of Haiti, it was the blacks who fought against the French, the Spanish and the English to liberate themselves. On the official website of the American Colonization Society, it documents that declaring independence on January the 1st, 1804, the new Republic of Haiti became the world's first black republic and the first independent nation in the Caribbean. The Haitian Revolution is also the only successful attempt where enslaved people liberated themselves from a colonial power in the Western Hemisphere. We owe incomparably to Haiti, Frederick Douglass said in 1893, as the original emancipator of the 19th century. Until Haiti struck for freedom, the conscience of the Christian world slept profoundly over slavery. Until she spoke, no Christian nation had abolished Negro slavery. Until she spoke, the slave trade was sanctioned by all the Christian nations of the world. Until Haiti spoke, the church was silent and the pulpit was dumb. 2 centuries later, in both England and in the United States, nothing has really changed. The church systems still function exactly the same. And when you address racism, their true colors start to come out. And they cleverly use psychology through their theology to market Western superiority under the disguise of the gospel by saying, well, it's not about race, it's about grace. It's not about skin, it's about sin. Jesus Christ did not come to do away with racism, and there is a reason why they are saying this.
But I want to flip that upside down, because I think the other side of it is true with our nation's history. We understand the curse that was slavery, white people do, and we say that was bad, but we miss the blessing of slavery, that it actually built up the framework for the world that white people live in and lived in. And so a lot of people call this white privilege, and when you say those two words, it just is like a fuse goes off for a lot of white people.
And if you challenge this theological justification of slavery, they will falsely label you as a social justice warrior. This is why a lot of blacks are frustrated and fed up, for they see people talking about the end times and Jesus is coming soon, but when they observe their fruits, not much has changed since their plantation days, and the narrator will explain why. On the 21st of September 2018, the narrator received a WhatsApp message concerning one of his videos from a brother in Christ. The narrator will keep the sender's name anonymous, but he will share to the public a portion of that message. It read, "Just to let you know that I've been receiving feedback from some of the older brethren here and overseas about your videos. And some are starting to become a little concerned that you are starting to veer off too much into history and the narrator will stress and the race issue, rather than making the third angel's message more clearer and simpler. Throughout the rest of this study, we shall closely assess and scrutinize this statement. When the narrator has spoken to people who have watched the videos who are not of a Christian background, and with people who have shared them with their non-Christian friends, The feedback the narrator has received is that they may not understand everything. They may not agree with everything, but they said they make you see the world for what it really is, and the videos are very simple and clear to understand. So the world says they are clear, but members of the church said that they are not. Did not Jesus in Luke chapter 16 and verse 8 say that the children of this world, the Gentiles, are in their generation wiser than the children of light? Jesus said that they have a better knowledge of discerning things than the church. We shall assess the accusations with the Holy Scriptures. In Matthew chapter 18 and verse 15, Jesus says that if thy brother shall trespass against thee, go and tell him his fault between thee and him alone. You do not go to somebody else. If he shall hear thee, thou hast gained thy brother. They ignored that divine counsel. Now, the narrator always makes it his duty to show a fair racial representation of Afro-Eurasians when making a point, so no one is excluded. But in the previous video, Racism and Reconciliation Part 1, a critic accused the narrator of creating more division than unity in the church. The narrator does not disagree with the critic. In Luke chapter 12 and verse 51, Jesus said that he did not come to bring peace, but division. For any new idea that rocks your comfort zone will agitate and provoke. And in Galatians chapter 4 and verse 16, it said that you will get enemies when you preach the truth. It comes with the territory. Most preachers prefer to stay silent on hot topics, especially the issue of race. Do you want to know why? For they loved the praise of men far more than the praise of God. John chapter 12 and verse 43 says. But in Luke chapter 6 and verse 26, Jesus says if everybody is praising you and gets your head, you better be very careful. Why? For that is how Satan fell. Pride and self-praise. Now, why is history important? An English socialist under the pen name of George Orwell said, by 2050, early probably, all real knowledge of old speak or true history will have disappeared. The whole literature of the past will have been destroyed. The whole climate of thought will be different. In fact, there will be no thought as we understand it now. This is from a secular perspective. In Ecclesiastes chapter 3 and verse 15, Romans chapter 14 and verse 4, and 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 11, God, working through mortal men, advised us that we are to learn from history, for it will repeat itself over and over again. There has to be a reason that from Matthew to Revelation, God says we have to learn from the mistakes of Sodom and Gomorrah. They are put in the Holy Scriptures for a very good reason. Twice Jesus takes us back into history. In Matthew chapter 24 and verse 37, Jesus said that you cannot understand neither the present nor the future if you do not understand the past. And in Mark chapter 10 verses 6 to 9, when he was dealing with the institution of marriage, especially concerning divorce, he takes us right back to the beginning of time, when it was first introduced at creation between a man and a woman. No gender neutrality. So the narrator makes it his duty to study history using the Holy Scriptures as his foundation, so that individuals are not manipulated about their knowledge of the past, and so that they know their place in time and space, and they don't live in a warped reality. The narrator will give one more example why. In both Job chapter 14 verses 10 to 12 and John chapter 11 verses 11 to 14, the Holy Scriptures in both the Old and New Testament is unequivocally clear that it describes death as a sleep, and is explicit and very clear that in Daniel chapter 12 and verse 2, John chapter 5 verses 28 and 29, and in Acts chapter 24 and verse 15, that those that sleep in the dust or in the graves will only awake again at either the resurrection of life for the just that will lead to everlasting life, or the resurrection of damnation for the unjust that will lead to everlasting contempt. These are the clear divine statements on death. but in Genesis chapter 2 verses 16 and 17 and in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 4, there has been an ongoing conflict from creation right up until our time in the digital age on what happens at death. God said man will surely die if he picks the fruit. And the serpent said to man that there is no such thing as death. The false ideology of the latter has sadly had the greatest impact on man's views of the afterlife that is still expressed through advertising and the enticing influence of edutainment.
In this horror adventure game, you'll uncover the mysteries surrounding the ethereal but deadly Mount Hikami, believed to be at the center of many disappearances. Ghosts frequent this mountain. Your only defense is a camera that can repel and cast them out.
Oh, bonsoir, madame.
Hi there. All right.
That's a beauty of a sign, ma'am.
This isn't your first life, Evan. You are an infinite. You've lived and died 1,000 times.
I'm a reincarnation.
If you can remember who you were, you will understand who you can become.
This is why it is so vitally important to study the past, because it makes you have a clear understanding of why people behave a specific way and how things work in the present. Let us now look at the controversial issue of race. A study was published in 2007 on how the black churches have played a central role in the stability of both the African American and Caribbean black community in the United States. After the Reconstruction era, both the Negroes from the southern states and the black West Indians migrated to the north, and they were both of agrarian peasant origins. Though they both had a strong work ethic and were very competitive of each other, there were some underlying issues that have only recently come to light. Western scientists have recently studied the DNA of over 50,000 people of African descent on both sides of the Atlantic, and they discovered something that is quite interesting. They found that the past still has a deeply unconscious effect on the present that is still carried on in your genes. It is known as multi-generational trauma, titled as epigenetics, which is the intergenerational transmission of trauma. A person of black African descent can watch a scene of a slave film, and 2 centuries later it can still trigger off a very deep, uncontrolled, negative psychological reaction in your body. Why? Because blacks have never fully healed from the after effects of the violence, rape, diseases, and humiliation that took place during slavery and colonialism. The trauma is still there, and it still manifests itself when you closely observe how black people treat each other as a result of their unresolved trauma. For you behave according to how you view yourself. As the proverb says, for as he thinketh in his heart, so is he. And they are also very envious of each other's accomplishments. The narrator calls it the Ahab complex, a very deep-rooted self-hatred that makes them very, very jealous of what each other have worked hard for. In an article titled Black Moses, Red Scare in the Washington Post and Preventing the Rise of a Messiah in the London Guardian, they both document that men are paid to infiltrate the black community to create confusion. This ex-FBI informant made the most troubling revelations when he said that the US government in the 1960s, to prevent any form of radical thinking, closely watches the behavioral patterns and every latest trend in the black community, from influential speakers to the latest styles of fashion in both their clothing and even in their hairstyles, their theatre, their latest dance moves, their music, the literature that clearly identifies how the Western system works, and the institutions blacks join where they can influence famous black people to feminize the black male and their central role in society to discredit and undermine the black family unit. This is why many are trying ever so hard to restore that sacred institution that God set up at the beginning of time, for they can see that it is under attack by the left-leaning rainbow movement. Though blacks have had quite a bit of a raw deal, the narrator has closely observed their consumer spending power in both the UK and in the United States. The racial income gap is very blatant in the United States, but a Nielsen report documented in Fortune magazine put African Americans' annual spending at $1.2 trillion. They ain't poor. And in the UK, though white households' income is 63% higher than blacks, which is obvious because they make up 85% of the population, and a lot of British wealth is inherited from the fortunes of the slave trade, blacks spend £300 billion a year. But how much of this is invested back into their own communities to build up their own race? When you address this to blacks, there is complete silence among the children of Kush. The narrator has always received defensiveness or silence when he tells blacks in the church on how they plan to reach blacks in the world with the gospel. For if you come with any watered down rubbish to black men, they will think you are a fool. And if you come with any foolishness to black women, they will look at you like so and tell you about yourself. For the narrator knows that if you come correct with the right gospel, it will have a positive impact on an open mind. The Western churches have not only created a lot of damage to the blacks in the diaspora, misrepresenting the character of God through their behavior and false theology, but Africa has also been exploited, and during the days of colonialism, they would also be transported like gods in an exact similar fashion as the African chiefs, where they still have the belief that blacks only received civilization and Christianity when they interacted with modern Europeans. This is why a number of post-slavery movements got started in the Caribbean, Latin America, and in North America because of the distortion and misrepresentation of the character of God by Europeans, but that is because they have been taught the wrong side of history. Real black intellectuals who studied the Bible in its true light alongside proper history knew that there was a dilution of true facts. The late Walter Rodney said that Ethiopia was a major center in the biblical world along with Jordan, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. It is clear that Christianity must have begun to spread in Ethiopia from the earliest days of Christ's teachings. Now the Ethiopian was willing to be saved by Jesus Christ, or Lauda Equiano said, the sinner's only surety, and also to rely on none other person or thing for salvation. But who was this Ethiopian? In the time of our Savior, and indeed from that time forward, George Washington Williams said, by Ethiopia was meant in a general sense the countries south of Egypt. In the Acts of the Apostles, we have a very full and interesting account of the conversion and immersion of the Ethiopian eunuch, a man of Ethiopia, an eunuch of great authority under Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, who had the charge of all her treasure and had come to Jerusalem to worship. Candace was the queen who reigned in Upper Egypt up the Nile and lived at Meroe, that ancient city, the very cradle of Egyptian civilization. The Nubian kingdom of Sudan, now a desert, was once a prosperous civilization. But the eunuch, when reading the book of Isaiah, was seeking for something a lot deeper, and he left behind the worship of the scavenger, the bird, the vulture, that was revered in that culture, the fastest bird on earth, the peregrine falcon adorned by their kings, the homage to the goat that the kings also revered in their artwork, and the global worship of the blazing sun that the black pharaohs like Shabaka received in his worship. Very few people are aware of the black Christian kingdoms in both the Sudan and in Ethiopia, and there are some in their attempts to decolonize the African mind. Instead of restoring them back to the true worship of God, they are returning vulnerable and frustrated blacks back to the religion of Nimrod.
You know, I say it simply, that spirituality is your reality. It is your relationship to cosmology and ecology.
Feel the force around you. Here, between you, me, the tree, the rock, everywhere. Yes. Even between the lands.
Our spirituality is our relationship, number one, with our water. Number two, the relationship with our air. Number three, the relationship with our land. That's African spirituality. God is a woman, and through whom we all have become.
You believe God is a woman.
You may find that you are related to the crocodile, you are related to the fish, you are related to the bird, you are related to the buffalo, you are related to the rabbit, you are related to the hyena. It means that if I belong to the buffalo, when I go hunting, I don't kill a buffalo because the buffalo is my relative.
The narrator would like to give a word of caution. If you see a buffalo running towards you and you say, "Hey cuz," it won't take you very long to find out that it is not your relative. Do you want to know why? Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, and to birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. This is what false philosophy does, and this man was once a very influential, dynamic preacher. But when your faith is too rooted in an institution and in the failings of mortal man, and not in the divine power of Jesus Christ, you become disillusioned, and we are advised in Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 and 25, that when your spiritual foundation is totally rooted in Jesus Christ, the rock, and not in a church denominational system, when the winds of false doctrines come, as Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 14 forewarns us, no false philosophy will be able to move you, neither shake you. If colonial and plantation-minded blacks who are psychologically controlled by Western theology and not the Bible are uncomfortable with dealing with the issue of race, and if white Caucasian people are also at unease with addressing the issue of race, and if Asians are also offended and do not care if people are putting their God on trial, it only shows where they are all at spiritually. As the narrator knows that there are people sincerely seeking and searching for the truth, he has to counteract these errors, and that is one of the reasons why he has to have a thorough knowledge of history and has to study the race issue using a rare method mentioned in a previous study titled Freedom Under Siege called qualitative research. He will explain again to the viewers what it entails. Qualitative research involves an interpretive, naturalistic approach to the world. Qualitative research is a field of inquiry in its own right. It cross-cuts disciplines, fields, and subject matter, such as case study, and the narrator has highlighted history, politics and ethics, participatory inquiry, interviewing, participant observation, evidence-based, visual methods, and interpretive analysis. The qualitative researcher Brocoleur uses the aesthetic and material tools from many different disciplines: personal experience, introspection, life story, artifacts and cultural texts and productions, along with observational, historical, interactional, and visual texts. It is a method that is also rooted in Paul's style of being able to understand that different communities all have a different outlook and view of how they see the world. For the Jews require a sign that is their mindset, and the Greeks are rooted in the philosophy of Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates seek after wisdom. Unto the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might gain the Jews. To them that are under the law as under the law, that I might gain them that are under the law. To them that are without law as without law, being not without law to God, but under the law to Christ, that I might gain them that are without the law. To the weak became I as weak, that I might gain the weak. I made all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Most of us live in very overcrowded cities, but have our churches provided the tools to reach the different communities, whether they are happy rich kids in prosperous communities or very unhappy children in deprived neighborhoods? Can you intellectually counteract modern arguments with evidence? Because anything you say to people, they will instantly research it online. And if you come with any outdated foolishness, then you have defeated your cause. Can you even tell if two women are just friends? Because the climate is very different today. And can you handle interracial couples? Because it seems to be a problem in the churches. Because if you cannot deal with the race issue within your own communities, you will have difficulties in doing outreach. If the Western churches want to gain an influence in their societies, they need to lead by example by upholding the sacred institution of marriage that was set up by God at the beginning of time. The open display of sincere and not fake and artificial love between a man and a woman will be a powerful testimony to the environment they live in and for the next generation that is coming up. You cannot complain about the rainbow movement's influence if your divorce rate is even higher than the secular society you live in, or if these wicked modern day ministers are misquoting the Holy Scriptures to justify men abusing their wives, when the Bible is unequivocally clear in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 28 that men should love their wives as their own bodies. And 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 7 said that if a man does not take care of his wife, guess what? His prayers will definitely be hindered. That is why a lot of these wicked men are praying for hours and not receiving any answers from heaven. Women also need to play their roles, for instead of them dealing with their unresolved issues, they bring their dysfunctional parts into the marriage with a very strange idea that the union will heal their trauma, and are unaware of the damage they also cause to innocent men. For in Proverbs chapter 21 verses 9 and 19, the Bible said that it is better to be either in the attic or among the wild animals in the wilderness than with a woman who has deep unresolved issues. So an old woman instructed her son in Proverbs chapter 31 that the best women to look for are the virtuous ones, those who are caring and loving to their men. And just as the narrator advised the blacks as well as other ethnic groups, if you lead by example, the open mind will hear anything you have to say. For at the moment, these Western churches are aware that they are in a crisis. The Western churches also know that they are declining rapidly. But instead of looking at the man in the mirror, they blame others and are praying for a revival inside of the churches with the hope that it will usher in the second coming of Christ, not realizing that the revival starts first in their own hearts. Though the churches have a control over the health systems in America, as well as many of the academic institutions, and are loaded with billions of dollars, as was shown in part 1, they still looked to Donald Trump as their savior to revive their nation. And what were the results? It did lead to a revival of racist white supremacy inside the society and also inside of the churches, but also a continuous spiritual decline inside of the churches. Do you want to know why? The narrator will tell you. Reformations are not made, they must grow, Dr. Wiley said. They cannot be evoked by royal proclamations or by parliamentary edicts or by Congress. They must be planted by the patient labor of evangelists and watered not infrequently by the blood of the martyrs, like the Waldenses. One of the reasons many are upset with Even at the Doors videos, because these critics are stuck in a time warp and live in the past. They are not aware that we no longer live in the vinyl, retro, vintage, analog, non-linear era, but we have all been coerced since 9/11 into the closely surveillanced digital age, where nearly every aspect of our lives are monitored by the digital traces that we leave behind, where nations and companies' free speech are being stripped from them if they step out of line. Now, the narrator lives in a country that has been categorized as one of the most secular nations on the entire earth, where 70% of young Brits are not religious, and 25%, that is 1/4 of professed Christians in the UK, do not even believe that Jesus Christ was resurrected from the grave. And within that climate, a Church of England minister was to have a very interesting awakening, when he was reported to the anti-terror unit for telling pupils that they can disagree with the LGBT teaching. You see, we do live in an age where hate preachers will be treated as a priority threat and tackled as part of the government's counter-terrorism strategy in the UK. This is where we are heading, and if you profess to be a Christian and you are still deeply divided over the issue of race within your own churches and within your own heart, and you have no interest in healing that rift, when that final test comes at the end, guess what? You will not be able to stand. This is the most interesting, exciting, and challenging times to live in. And for those who are really seeking and striving to make it into eternity, in this final testing period, you're going to face many obstacles from family, friends, and government. And I pray that myself and yourself will be able to stand. In the next and final study, part 3, I'm going to show you why I put this study together. And if life is spared, please continue researching everything you see in the study and stay blessed.